Hello, everyone. This talk is about the theming capabilities built into edX. We will look at both past and present technologies that allow us to theme our instances. So my name is Matjaz Gregoric, and I am a software developer at Tokencraft. First, what is theming? The basic function of theming is changing how your site looks and feels. You are usually most often only concerned with theming the end-user-facing parts of the system. For example, for edX, that would be the LMS. But sometimes you may also want to theme the backend, like the edX Studio. Theming allows you to change colors, images, text, and it also lets you modify the layout. A simple layout modification would be injecting some links into the header or the footer, and a more complex layout modification could completely shuffle things around, either by injecting some complex CSS rules or just by changing the structure of your HTML. And why would you want to theme your site? The most common motivation is branding. Most often when you install a new edX instance, you will want to use your own company's logo instead of the stock edX one. And you may also want to change the default edX blue to some color from your company's own color palette. If you have existing corporate sites, you may want to make the LMS look similar to the corporate site so that when users move from one system to another, the experience is more consistent. Or you may just want to make your site look different from the competition. Another reason is theming for legal reasons. In this case, you are not concerned about the looks, but about the content. For example, the theming system in edX lets you change the text on the terms of service and honor code pages, and it also lets you replace the default copyright notice in the footer with your own text if the default doesn't work for you. Finally, theming lets you do functional changes. For example, you can add custom links into the header or the footer, or you can replace the login button with a link to a third-party single sign-on solution. And another common reason to theme your site is to make it more responsive so that it works better on mobile devices. The default edX theme has been improved in this responsiveness area a bit, but it's still far from perfect. Now we look how the theming system in edX came to be. Before there was any officially supported system built in, the only way to theme your site was to fork the edX platform repository and make changes inline. That's very nice because it lets you change anything, but it's a maintenance nightmare. edX moves really fast, and every time you upgrade to a new release, you will have to rebase your changes, you will run into lots of code conflicts, and basically have a very bad time. So forking is not a viable solution for theming. And the team at Stanford were very much aware of that. So before they launched their edX site, they had to come up with a solution for theming. And that's how the first theming system built into edX came to be. It was contributed in GitHub pull request number 57. And it has since been known as the Stanford theming system. It would let you override static content such as images, templates, Django or Mako templates, and it would let you add custom static pages. Stanford developed a sample theme that they put on GitHub, and the common workflow when you were developing a new theme was that you would fork this repository and make your changes and develop your custom theme on top of the sample theme. This is what the sample theme looked like. The nice thing about Stanford theming was that it was the first officially supported theming system that was built into edX. It would let you overwrite any static file and any Django or Macro template. It also had SAS support built in, so when you issue the paver command to generate your assets, it would build your SAS together with the SAS in edX platform. And the most common modifications were easy to make, but more complex things were trickier. Stanford theming had some issues. One of them was not being able to overwrite arbitrary SAS files. And while overriding arbitrary files is usually not a great idea, it's sometimes the simplest solution that doesn't involve copying large amounts of CSS. Stanford theming had no support for Studio. It was LMS only. And because the Stanford was a bit in a hurry to rush their site, so the implementation was a bit hackish in some areas. Like there were areas in the code where it would say, if using Stanford theming, inject this content, otherwise inject this. And Stanford theming was a single theme per instance only. And this was a problem for the solutions team, which had a task to build multi-tenancy into OpenEdX. And they had to add some limited support for theming so that each microsite could be themed differently. And so they developed their own system, which was known as the Microsite Theming system. It would let you add custom additional CSS per microsite. It would let you overwrite certain images, and it would also let you overwrite templates, all of this per microsite. The obvious advantage of microsite theming was that it supported multi-tenancy. So if you looked at the site from one domain, it looked different than if you looked at it from another domain. But it could only override specific images, and it had no SAS support. Both microsite theming and Stanford theming coexisted for a while, but you could not use them at the same time. You had to pick one or the other. So if you needed multi-tenancy, you would typically go with microsite theming, and if not, you would probably use Stanford. And that's how we come to comprehensive theming, which merges this multi-tenancy with the basic approach of Stanford theming. Comprehensive theming was first released in Dogwood and has seen some significant improvements in Eucalyptus. It is similar to Stanford theming, but it's more consistent, and the implementation is much cleaner. And like we said, it supports multi-tenancy. In addition to the LMS, it also supports the Studio and e-commerce. It lets you overwrite any static file and any Django or Macro template, just like Stanford, but it also lets you overwrite any SAS file or partial. This is nice because it makes all three aspects of theming, static files, templates, and SAS, very consistent. Now, while I was preparing for this talk, I found this repository on the edX GitHub account. It contains a sample theme for the LMS and e-commerce, and it seems to serve a similar purpose as the sample Stanford theme we saw before, but I don't remember ever seeing it publicly announced, so I'm not sure what the status of it is. But it looks like this. As you can see, there are areas where you're supposed to replace the default content with your own. Let's look at some examples. This is a very simple theme. It changes the logo, the color of the button, the background image on the homepage, and that's about it. This one is similar. Custom logo, custom colors, images, but not much else. This one is similar again, except that the background of the header is dark, which means that you also have to change the color of the text, because otherwise it's not very visible on dark background. And we found that that's currently not as simple to do as it could have been. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. Now, this theme wasn't built by Tokencraft, but I included it here because it looks nice, and I think it was built on the sample theme that we saw earlier because the structure of the header looks very similar. And this is an example of a theme that doesn't look anything like the default edX theme. Now that we've learned what comprehensive theming can do, let's talk about some best practices that we try to stick to at Tokencraft. The first one is just to try to keep your theme small. The smaller the theme is, the easier it will be to upgrade to a new release. The second thing is always prefer CSS changes over template overrides, because we found that template overrides are the worst. Templates change all the time, and every time you upgrade to a new release, you have to go through each template, figure out what has changed upstream, merge your changes back, and it takes a long time, and I'm sure nobody enjoys doing that. That said, you should still try to keep CSS small, because even if you have huge amounts of CSS, that still tends to break the layout when you upgrade. But at least it only breaks the look. It will not start producing server errors. And it's usually easier to debug and fix. Next thing is to try to use the built-in SAS variables if possible. There are quite a lot of SAS variables already built into edX platform. Some work better than the others, but you should try it first, and if it works, just stick to it, because it's less likely to break when you upgrade. And there are some potential improvements that I think would make theming easier, especially from the maintenance perspective. The first is the ability to overwrite named blocks in Django or Macro templates. Currently, you cannot overwrite like a single block from a template. You have to copy the whole thing and then maintain it through releases. And one example would be changing the login button in the header with a link to a third-party SSO solution. Now, the login button is neatly wrapped in this navigation sign-in block, but unfortunately, there's no way to overwrite just this block. You have to copy the entire template. And solutions for this problem exist. There's a Django package called Django Overextends that lets you overwrite and extend the overridden template at the same time, which is basically what we need here. And I actually think that this is built into Django 1.9 out of the box. Unfortunately, simply upgrading to Django 1.9 won't solve things for edX platform, because first of all, we use Meko, we don't use a lot of standard Django templates. And second, we also use dynamic template lookups, so there will probably have to be some custom code involved. And once we have the ability to override specific blocks, we should try to use more of them. It's still not a good idea to go overriding blocks all over the place, but it's still better than overriding entire templates. The other thing I mentioned a bit earlier is improving the built-in SAS variables. There are already a lot of variables, but not all of them work consistently. Some don't work at all. Some are overridden later below in the default OpenEDX style sheet. So when you try to change the color of some buttons, for example, you have to copy the CSS and replace the hard-coded colors with your desired value. Another example I mentioned earlier is changing just the color of the text in the header. Because we have very nice SAS variables that allow you to change the background color of the header or the footer. You set them to your desired color and it just works. But there's nothing like that for the color of the text. So if you're changing the color to dark, you have to do a lot of extra work just to change the text. In conclusion, we've seen that comprehensive theming has evolved from quick and dirty solutions into a pretty decent theming system. It has come a long way, but there are still areas where it could use some improvement. And being able to override chunks of templates would be one of the most important upgrades, I believe. And until we have that, and also after we have that, please try to keep template overrides to a minimum. Now at Tokencraft, we will be closely following further development of theming. I hope we will be able to contribute some of our own ideas, both in terms of feedback and code, and I would like to welcome the community to do the same. So we can discuss these things on the mailing list and on Slack. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions or comments, suggestions. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really informative. At edX, we still use the Stanford theming, but I would like to know a little bit more about the blocks and overrides that are available with the new comprehensive theming. So you mentioned that HTML template blocks are not yet available, right? Templates blocks override. So you still have, okay. Yes. So what about the SAS overrides? How this have been developed? So I still haven't found, I haven't looked really well into the documentation, but I would like to. Okay. So I would like to hear from you about how many overrides are possible. What are there? I mean, are there any missing SAS overrides that?
SAS variables.
No, not just variables. I mean SAS
overriding
for the specific class. Can I override the specific class in the SAS?
You can override a specific class, yes, but you can add your custom CSS to the bottom of the default styles, and you can.
No, can I replace a complete partial? Is that supported?
You can replace a complete partial, yes.
So I remove the edX, not just like patching it until I...
Yeah, it works very similar to template overrides. If you name it, if you give it the same name as in edX platform and put it in the same place, it will use your version instead of the...
So, and that was not supported in the Stanford theming, right?
Yeah, right. That was not supported
Thank you.
in Stanford, yes.
That's just a SAS feature. That's not like the edX.
Yeah, so at Stanford, so we're actually in the process right now of switching over from Stanford theming, putting that to rest, and switching over to comp theming. And one of the things that's held us up was the use of blocks. We leveraged those Mako blocks a lot. What we've actually found that allowed us to essentially make that a non-issue is instead of using blocks, just moving those into fragments. So instead of defining a Mako block, simply moving that into to a partial HTML file, and then we can override that at will. Have you guys looked into doing that?
No, not really, because I would have to see the code. I'm not really sure how that
so
solves
like
the problem.
literally instead of having a Mako block and then overriding that, you just move the contents of that block into an HTML file. So then you can shadow it just like anything else.
That would need to happen in the edX platform repository.
Sure, but I mean that's the follow-up. That then allows us to then completely move away from this, and I think that's the overarching thing that then needs the follow-up work for the edX platform to be changed is then moving specific blocks into or specific areas into separate files instead of having these massive aggregate template files.
That could work, but we would end up with a massive amount of templates if we put each chunk into a separate template. So it's an interesting solution, but I would prefer to see template overrides.
Sure.
Hi, Julio, also from Stanford, and I'm the one that created pull request 57. So we actually have a couple things that we're currently doing now. So what you can do is in Mako and Django, you can inherit a file, and then you don't actually change anything except redefine the same block that you want to override, and that gives you block overriding. So you say inherit main, because if you look at the other things, they inherit main and then they make changes, but don't actually replace any of the content on main, like the rest of it.
You still need the content in the overridden file, right?
The overridden file needs to have the block. So if it has a name block, you can say inherit from that template, and then you redefine the block, and it just swaps out the block and leaves the rest as it is. So you can do that. That does exist and it does work. We do that. Another one is you can put optional includes in your templates on platform, and with the comp theming, what that does is any theme that has this template defined, it'll take it, and if it doesn't, it just ignores it. And on platform, it's just an injection, which means it's very low risk for conflicts, and even if there are, you want that. So it's an easy conflict to resolve. So that's another one to consider for those kinds of situations. And then, in the CSS, you covered that. So,
yeah, thank you very much for both the comments and for creating pull request number 57.
But I think you were talking about override at a different level, right? You were talking about override just a specific section of an included block, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, whereas, Julio, you're talking about being able to include another block instead.
I said two things.
Right.
Both things are possible right now.
Overriding just part of a template, though?
Yes.
I mean, part of a block template?
Yes.
Okay.
So many of the things, the conversations around themes centers around making minimal changes to avoid future conflict. I mean, it seems like we have this artificial yoke around our necks, right? Is there any plan to fix that on a more permanent basis? And I've had a number of conversations already. You don't have this theming conflict or major issues as much as it is in edX, as it is in something like WordPress. You can easily flip out themes in and out without having problems, right? And you can define your templates, you can do everything else without having these major conflicts. So is there any intention to go towards that? This is not something that doesn't exist, it's already out there. And the question now is there any plans to adapt something like that versus having this yoke on your neck always saying, hey, just make minimal changes because of future conflicts and just make these little changes and avoid the conflicts?
Yes, I think everyone would like to see a better solution, but it's a difficult problem, and we are working towards it. This morning we had an interesting discussion, and we decided on some future steps. So I'm sure we will see improvements. I'm just not sure how fast this will come.
The short answer is yes. And it's going to be more of a revolution than an evolution. So I think the future direction is much more toward React JSX based. So encapsulated components with CSS encapsulation that don't leak out. I mean, the problem with edX platform is much, much more complex than something like a WordPress, which essentially is a CMS which generates a static site, right? So I think just by nature of it is much harder to solve. You know, as far as global theming, I think the way that we're thinking of moving forward is using the Bootstrap framework, Bootstrap 4. So like we just punt that problem to Bootstrap. So you know, you don't end up with variable that gets overridden down the path or gets hard-coded. So the exact problem that you're talking about, like header background versus header text, like that's all stuff that Bootstrap solves. So we don't have to solve that problem. Where we solve the problem, and that addresses exactly like block element overrides. You know, there's no such thing as a block. Like your entire page is a component made of components made of components made of components. So at the smallest atomic level of a component, if you want to swat that component out, you know, go to town, because that's your problem. Or if you want to change, I think in your example it was like a navigation,
yes,
specific like navigation within a specific part, right? In that case, you just say, okay, well, I have a navigation component that's made up of these subcomponents. Well, I want to keep some of the subcomponents and inject my own, then you know, I'll just make a new navigation parent that takes existing components, add my own component, remove other components, do whatever you want. They're just markup at the end of the day. Of course, new components, you have to create that new tag or new custom component. But yeah, I think we have a good way of separating out, even at the presentation layer, styling from the HTML. And then you know you have a whole other layer for behavior that then you can mix and match. That's kind of the long-term thing. It's a long ways from now, but that is like the direction that we're looking at. But like I said, that would be much more of a revolution. It's like a complete, like it has nothing to do with this, basically.
But I think in a previous conversation, the move towards Bootstrap, I think is on a roadmap for either the next release or the release after.
Partially, yeah.
Partially.
It'll be in like the whatever dash B3 is the Bootstrap folder. But that's a very small step.
Okay.
Like that's like good. That's a pretty low bar.
Any other questions?
You talked about SAS partials override.
Yes.
And to be honest, I've done the SAS files override and the SAS partials, but with the partials sometimes it breaks and it doesn't exactly render like you want it to be. Like it doesn't like you sometimes there's some other partial or some other file on the edX platform that is overriding the partial that you are overriding, and you end up with an override hell. And
yeah,
like
I can imagine. I did not run into this particular problem, but
yeah.
So with that, I think you just have to be really cognizant of the build pipeline and make sure your stuff comes later than any of the edX stuff. And again, that is something with the new system we're going to simplify much more. You know, there's Django's not going to be involved in asset pipeline stuff for the new stuff anymore. It's all going to be node-based, which is a lot more clear what's going on, and it's much more declarative rather than, I think, Django compressor is what we use right now. So yeah, so it'll be much more of a like open source community standard rather than like this rat's nest of stuff that Django's not well suited to deal with.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I feel like missing from this. So we're focusing a lot on the styling and the look and the feel. But how do you guys handle custom data, custom logic that needs passed through? It's one thing to say don't fork the template, don't fork the CSS, but when you need to pass additional context, how much work do you do with that? And then what are your thoughts there?
Well, if we have to do it, we try to upstream our changes. So.
Right. So I mean, and I get it, right? And I think because this has come up in a couple of the talks, though.
Yes.
But the reality is that's just not possible for everyone. There are legitimate features that people build that are put behind feature flags, and then the response from edX is, we still don't want it though. And so I think this is where the idea, that balance between the idealism and the practicality of it is. Yeah. So I have some ideas. If people want to talk about it later, let me know.
Okay.
Yeah, my short response to that would be to use Django's facility. I mean, it sounds like potentially the cleanest way is to just have your own sub URL scheme, right? And you direct to that sub URL, and that's its own self-contained Django app, which still allows you to import stuff from Django LMS or wherever that you want. And then you create your own views, you control your own templates, you can even control your own asset pipeline or whatever for that, from that URL path down is like yours. That's I guess off the cuff, that's kind of I'm just trying to think of the most Django way of doing it.
Yeah, it still doesn't quite solve it. I mean, because it really is when you want to change something on. It's one thing to. I mean, if you're building something new, right? Sure, put it on a new URL, separate as much as you can. But that still doesn't address what happens when you're trying to change something that exists. That's the unsolved problem.
Okay, so thank you very much. And